Hi, and welcome to another episode of Prodigy Search Presents. I'm Mark Rick Jr., partner at Prodigy Search. Today, we're going to take a quick detour from our interview series and discuss resumes. If you've seen from our earlier sharing of the candidate resource packet, resumes was the very first topic we talked about. And clearly, during these times, it's incredibly important to have some best practices, some tips and tricks at your disposal. Clearly, with resumes, it's a very unique thing, right? That everybody has an opinion. And I think what's most important is that the candidate takes ownership of that document, right? How they look, what they should say, how they read, etc. The thing that I think is most important about the resume is you as a candidate with your resume. There are resume rules, and then there's also just some people's opinions, right? They like the layout, they like the format, they want this bullet point in there, they prefer that adjective. Again, there's resume rules, which is kind of standard practices. Everybody agrees that this is what should be going on with resume, and then there's everybody's opinion. So let's talk about some things that I think are critical to look at when it comes to resumes. First and foremost, length. And here's the tricky thing about length, right? Because the difference between a resume and a CV has no page limit. CVs can be 3, 5, 10. Back in the day, I was on a search committee, and I remember seeing multiple CVs that were 15 plus pages. That's normal. Resumes, that's not the case. So let's focus on length for 1 second. Junior and mid-level candidates, again, not that mid and senior level, right? So you got to kind of distinguish between two. 1 page ideal, maybe 2 pages is acceptable as long as you can fill the entire second page. For executives, for senior level people, 2 pages, 3 pages, acceptable. You need to be able to fill that space clearly. Again, just to distinguish between the two, a CV is misused, generally speaking, here in the U.S. CV is an appropriate term in research, academics, medical, and again, most of the time outside of the U.S. The resume is the more common phrase. And again, it's important to distinguish between the two because length is one of the biggest things and what's included on your resume versus what's included in your CV. But again, too many pages, people will stop reading. Again, a lot of recruiters will spend 5, 7, maybe 10 seconds reviewing a resume. So length is critical. And I think one of the things that I tell people to look at when they're looking at what to include or not to include, right? If you're trying to figure out how to delete things, condense, make sure that it's the appropriate length. More importantly, the most important information is included, is look at what's relevant and what's real. Does this apply? Is it pertinent? Am I just filling space? What is it? That's important. Is it relevant to your career, to the job you're applying to? If it's not relevant, it probably can come off, right? Because otherwise it's just a filler. Also, recent's critical, right? And here's where I'd say it's a little bit more tricky to figure out, right? Because if it's 5 or 10 years old, that's normal to have on a resume, right? But if it's 20, 30 years old, and if you're an executive that's been in the industry for 30 years and you have something you did back in high school or college as a volunteer or a club, or you played college football 30 years ago, again, maybe not important to have on there if it's not relevant or recent. If it checks off both of those boxes, relevant and recent, it stays on there. What's also important to look at, I think, is some of the sections, right? Some of the key sections. And I'll tell you, I'll be honest with you, I've always had a tough time with the objective or summary, right? And I think both reading them, but also writing them myself. And I honestly, I'll tell you, at its core, if you can't write a really good objective or summary, if it's not absolutely perfect, take them out. That's valuable real estate, right? Everybody attempts to start it off with an objective or a summary. An objective is exactly what it sounds like, right? You're saying why you're writing. Again, typically what goes in a cover letter. A summary is just summarizing everything that you'll read throughout those accompanying 2, 3 pages. Again, I think if you can't do it the right way, I would say exclude those and fill in the most relevant and recent information that isn't just filler, which is what an objective or summary sometimes can be. 2 other big things about sections. Again, I think everybody kind of knows the standard sections: employment, education, skills, so on and so forth. But don't forget the very first thing. When people read at the top, your name, your contact information, phone, email, mail. Some people do exclude mailing addresses, but at the very least, they put the city and state they live in. I've seen a lot of people include their personal websites or their LinkedIn page and profile link. I think great sections. Make sure they're appropriate, right? Make sure the email address is an appropriate one, and make sure the cell phone is the most current and up-to-date one that you would use. The only other section I would point out that I think is kind of a pet peeve of mine, but also something we noticed quite a bit at Prodigy, is references available upon request. that should never be included. That phrase should never be included, and also references as an additional page should never be included. That's a separate document altogether, a separate attachment when you're sending electronically, and a separate document when you hand it to somebody or mail it to somebody. So that's critical. Let's talk about the look and the visuals of it, right? And there's a difference between kind of your standard issue traditional resume and 21st century resumes, right? So let's just kind of look at the look and visuals of a traditional resumes, right? Using things like bold and italics or underlining in terms of your section headings, using bullet points, hyphens, or another special character under those sections. But again, being consistent, not going between bullet point, special character, and hyphens, and having those be 3, 4 different, 5 different types. Fill the empty white space. It's not that you can't have empty white space in your document, but if your bullet points, for example, for your jobs are too short and sweet, add more detail, fill that space in so that it doesn't look like there's too much empty white space in that document. But I think it's important to when it comes to look and visuals, it's not just about, that's satisfying to the eyes, right? Because that's subjective. What's more important, it actually is easy to read, right? No 8-point fonts, no typed that are too in cursive or in a different type of font family that is too hard to read, both electronically or if you print it out, which is, I think, important. Again, readability, make sure, again, not just it looks good, but it also can be read. And then lastly, I would say on the look and the visuals, there are challenges and there are limitations to whether it's Microsoft Word or if it's other web-based pre-written and pre-filled in templates. Sometimes they're not the easiest to edit. They're not the easiest to perhaps submit to an online system, to an HR or recruiting company, and have it be read for keywords. So I would say steer clear if you can. Create your own. You don't need the pre-written templates. They're not necessary. But details do matter, right? If you're going to ask somebody in HR recruiting what they pay attention to, details are critical, right? So verb tenses. If you go back and forth and shift between present and past, and you do that too much and there's confusion, make sure they're accurate, make sure you're consistent, right? Because otherwise that's a mistake, right? People will pay attention to the details. And I would say one of the biggest things I always see is people repeating verbs. It's not that you can't ever do it, but if you use the same phrases and sold, marketed, responsible for, assisted, if you use those same words 4 or 5 different times, the repetition is unnecessary. You can either use an actual thesaurus, you can right click and look for alternative words. You can figure out any other word choice that is appropriate without repeating the same words over and over again. Again, generally speaking on a resume, we avoid first person, right? I or your own name and narrative form is a little bit unusual, more appropriate on a CV or clearly in a cover letter. Make sure it's error-free, right? Spelling, grammar, any other mistakes, dates. Make sure there's consistency and accuracy in the dates. You don't want people calling you out on an error you make, or frankly, just deleting or throwing it in the trash because you made errors or had issues with spelling or grammar. And I think one of the big things that's people always ask us at Prodigy is hard skills and soft skills and how to weave them in, right? Hard skills generally can go into a section, right? You can have your technology, your languages into a hard skills section, especially in our industry, right? If you're in ticketing, make sure you list out all those programs you're fully aware of and your level. Soft skills are a little more challenging, right? I would generally recommend not including them in a skills section, but rather weaving them throughout your entire document, weaving them throughout the way you describe your bullet points of job duties, accomplishments, and skills that apply to jobs you've had. If they're soft skills, weave them into your description, right? I would steer clear of using them as part of the skills section where more than likely hard skills is more impactful. But I think regardless of whether you're in sales or not, because people think this applies only to sales, details matter, right? So goals, numbers, percentages, examples, client, like names of clients, specifics are a must on a resume, right? Because I can write a generic resume for an engineer. I can write a generic resume for an accountant. I can write it for a salesperson, but the specifics, the details, the percentages and numbers, that's what's very important and very unique to you as the candidate. So those are critical to see because I think it helps the reader truly understand what you're about and what accomplishments you've achieved throughout your career. And also, listen, at the end of the day, at the very beginning of this, we talked about the length, whether it's 1, 2, or 3 pages, depending on your level and your years of experience. Order is critical, right? Where each section goes, how they appear, because as discussed, a lot of recruiters and HR people spend 5, 7 seconds, maybe some spend 10 seconds at a first glance. So the most important things coming first and foremost. Now, clearly people want accurate chronological layouts if they're not going for a functional resume. So make sure it's accurate in terms of chronological layout, but order of importance essentially means that the least important information can go on to page 2 or page 3 or at the bottom of page 1, so that if the reader doesn't get to it, they're not missing the most important information about you as a candidate. And I'd like to wrap this up just frankly talking about 21st century resumes. Here's the thing, right? So this is where it's a little bit new, where candidates are starting to have a second or a third version of the resume, really to supplement and complement, if not complement, the traditional resume, right? White paper, black ink, plain fonts, Times New Roman, something like that, right? Where candidates, not just in marketing and creative fields, graphic design, et cetera, but in all fields are trying to do, trying a different approach, right? They're using, on a creative resume, 21st century resume, a lot of it is about the look, the layout, the feel of it, not necessarily the content. The content we have to make sure is still consistent, right? But here are some basics of the 21st or creative resume. Color, graphics, you could use links, unique fonts and infographics. Now, when to use it is the thing, right? You can use it initially when applying for a position based on the company's culture, or perhaps after sending your traditional resume, not hearing back, you can try something unique and different, which is, okay, they didn't respond to my first traditional resume. I'm going to send a creative one now that is more, it's popping, right? It's eye-catching. But if you're applying for jobs in the creative field, in creative industry, I'd say it's almost a given. You have to submit a creative, it has to look, and you have to showcase your skills through a unique and creative resume. I think what's most important, though, is knowing the audience, right? So researching the company, looking on the job description. If that job description has informal, unique, fun language, and it urges people that are submitting their cover letters resumes to show off their individuality, their uniqueness, that's when a 21st century resume should be utilized. But make sure, again, some technical things, right? Make sure all the links are accessible. Your website, your Facebook, your Instagram, your YouTube page, whatever it is, make sure all of them are accessible and that they work. Make sure they work on every computer, web browser, phone, mobile, et cetera. I mean, make sure that if you're using creative, that it's readable on all these formats, but the links are all able to be accessed as well. And I would say what's also critical is that the PDF version is one I would utilize in this sense, right? It doesn't lose any formatting. Again, I think a clean version of Microsoft Word one is a good one. But if you can PDF your creative and 21st century resume, it's a great bonus, clearly, so that it doesn't lose any of that creative formatting that you want to try to achieve. But I mentioned content a second ago, so here's how I'm going to wrap it up. That content is still key. The keywords, the buzzwords, the phrases. People are still looking for what you accomplished. It isn't just that you use the most unique infographic on your 21st century resume, or that you have a unique font, or that you decide to use navy blue instead of black color. That I think the information that is still enclosed in there, HR and recruiters and hiring managers still will do keyword search. They still will hunt through their systems, through their CRMs, their HR databases for keywords and buzzwords and phrases and titles. So content is still key on your 21st century resume. It just can't all be about the look. So this, again, was a unique version of Prodigy Search Presents, focused on resumes, both your traditional and your 21st century resumes. This is a series we'd like to continue and talking about other topics like cover letters, interviews, networking, you name it. But we'd like to kick off episode 1 of our candidate resource packet by talking about resumes. Hope you enjoyed.